Hello and welcome to Culture Hour Abridged. My name is Tim Lazinski, and in this episode I'm joined in the studio by Anthony Akata and Emilia Telese. So just briefly, Emilia, introduce yourself.
I'm a visual artist and writer and broadcaster, and I'm currently studying for a PhD in cultural policy with a focus on the idea of the artist as entrepreneur at Loughborough University.
Okay, and just briefly introduce yourself, Anthony.
Hello, I'm Anthony Carter, and I'm an artist, designer, scientist, mathematician, researching human-computer interaction. I'm currently studying multidisciplinary innovation at Northumbria University.
And you're not from around here either?
I'm not. I am from Birmingham, Alabama.
And Emilia, you're from Italy?
Yes, I'm from Italy. I've been living in the UK for the past 20 years. At the moment, I divide my time between the UK, Iceland, and Italy.
So, Anthony, tell me, what brings you to this part of the world than where you're from?
I applied for a Fulbright Award in 2016 and started the program last year. And so I'm here to study.
Tell us something about Fulbright, because we don't know what that means in the UK necessarily.
So Fulbright is a cultural exchange program where it's not just between the US and the UK, although that's one of the major partnerships between the two countries, but it's all over the world. So it's an exchange program where U.S. students will go to different parts of the world, and then other students from other countries come to the U.S. and study. So essentially an educational exchange program.
Okay. Emilia, do you consider yourself to be an exchange student?
No. I consider the UK to be my secondary home in a way, because I've lived more than half of my life here, mainly in Sussex. So I don't consider myself from one particular country anymore, although of course I was born in Italy. So I guess it's one of those things that when you've lived quite a long time in a different country, also because every 7 years all of the cells of your body renew, and effectively I'm almost 3 times British now.
Yeah. I like having conversations with people who come from a non-English speaking culture to find out strange little things like how is it when you live in England? When did you stop dreaming in your mother tongue and begin dreaming in English, and knowing it like that your dreams are actually in a foreign tongue to your own birth tongue?
Well, now actually it's not even confined to dreams, because I started dreaming in English probably about 8 months after I arrived here, but I now think in English as well when I'm fully awake. So it's not just dreams, not just unconscious, but I'm very consciously thinking and writing in English as well as Italian. It's different. When you become bilingual, you grow to express yourself in different languages according to the register that you've used for one particular thing. So, for example, because I've lived most of my professional life in the UK, when I talk about art, I talk about it in English. And when I talk about, for example, literature, because I studied classics in Italy, I mainly express myself in Italian, so it's really interesting. Yeah.
Does that mean that not just the linguistic expression and the words that you use, but does your mindset, in a sense that you are talking about art in the UK or literature in Italy, is that change significant as well? Are you talking about arts policy and always thinking about a UK perspective, or do you think, well, the Italian perspective also is playing a role in that? Or is your study and Englishness that you have described as 3 times English, does that form the larger part of your concept in art versus literature?
I guess one of the things that I study in my PhD is the historical perspective of artists in the UK. So in that particular respect, I'm looking mainly at the UK. But the concept of an artist being a professional has been explored a lot in Italian history, because, for example, in the 15th century, all artists worked in the fabric of society as professionals in a way. So they had their own workshop where you could go and speak to them, and there would be apprentices there that would work with the main artist for 13 years, for example. I think that the apprenticeship was about 13 years. And so, in a way, that as a concept has been a concept that was very much also Italian in the Renaissance. So I guess I'm marrying the two, because it's not confined to one culture or the other. But I guess I'm exploring the different meaning that the idea of being an artist is in the two different countries.
Okay, so, and Antonia, you are an English speaker, but we would say English, meaning from England and our language is English. American English is not identical to British English. Just give me an example of having come to a part of England which is quite distinct, as Newcastle is, from the rest of the UK. Can you give us an insight onto how it's different from where you come from?
Just certain terminology is different, but it's just being willing to listen and understand, and being able to understand that there are those subtle differences in language. A lot of times I can think about even yesterday when I was picking up a parcel from my accommodation. I said, I need to pick up a package. And the security guard looked at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, parcel. So it's just understanding the nuance of language and kind of understanding that. And I think being open-minded to knowing that kind of the way that you speak, the way that you understand language may be different. And I think a lot of it helps because both of my parents are Nigerian. So I kind of already have that open-mindedness about like language and understanding the differences. So.
Okay. And what is your favorite Geordie terminology that you've discovered and we're like, it's brilliant, I want to use that? Have you picked up anything like that?
Not really.
Okay. So, but I do know that your planned project is inspired by the being on Tyneside. So just briefly tell me a little bit about what it is that being at Newcastle and being in Northumbria University, what is unique to that is inspiring you to see connections?
All my life has been I've used like bridge as a metaphor, like being an artist, and because I studied mathematics and I studied art, so I've always had to bridge disciplines and had to understand like how to think like an artist, but think like a scientist, and just the difference. And so being here in Newcastle, where bridges are everywhere, it's part of the culture, it's a part of the history of here. It's really significant because it's like everywhere I go, it's all around me, and it describes my experience being here as an African American from Birmingham, Alabama, being here in Newcastle, United Kingdom. It's just a metaphor of just my whole life, and of course, this experience being here.
Did you know before you came to Newcastle how much of the Industrial Revolution was rooted in this part of the country, let alone this part of the world?
I did not, but I learned about it being here.
I mean, that's one of the things that frustrates me about the innovations from this part of the world, are that other parts of the world don't recognize it. And for example, the electric light bulb, an American would say, who invented that light bulb?
Thomas Edison.
Exactly. And we would say Joseph Swan. And the Swan Edison company fought over that innovation. So, I mean, we're talking about design and technology rather than art, but is there a sense that there are things that you knew about, or you thought you knew about England, which when you got here, you were like, that is what I thought? Or otherwise, the art that you experienced and the culture of art and anything you could call art, what was your preconception, and how did reality kind of crush those preconceptions?
I don't think reality really it wasn't really like a shock to me, because for me, art is about being able to express yourself, but it's also being able to communicate a message to a broader audience. I mean, it's not really art until you release it into the world and other people get to experience it. And so I think in that sense, it's the same no matter where you go. But it's just being, I guess, open and willing to do that, and just understanding that art can be anywhere and everywhere.
And Amelia, how about yourself? Because you've obviously, from what you said, lived here for some time, but cast your mind back. What was it like coming from a place with even richer heritage of art than we have in this country.
Before coming to the UK in 1996, 97, I lived in Florence for 5 years, which is where I did my degree. The Fine Arts Academy in Florence is the oldest art school in the world, founded in 1563. So I was always coming from a point of view of an aesthetic appreciation of visual culture that was a given, was something that has been in the Italian psyche forever. And coming here, the main difference was that people didn't consider visual art to be, for example, as important as music or literature, or even visual elements. For example, in Italy, a lot of people just buy art for their home, and even if they're not from a particularly rich background, financially rich, they still buy the tiny bit of original art, and it's not something that people do as much here. I guess one of the things that I noticed was at the time I noticed that the high street in most British countries was quite full of franchising shops that were all the same everywhere. So I guess in Italy there was still the individual shop mentality, or the independent family-run shop, rather than the concept of a high street. So those were differences.
But that's I can speak for myself that when I was growing up, there was a lot less of that. There was a lot less franchising. There was a lot more local shops. I guess in America, they refer as a common cultural phrase, the mom and pop store. But I accuse America of exporting their franchising system and bringing it over here. And we've adopted one of the lesser savory elements of American consumer culture. So what is it like in Alabama? Is it the picture of America that I've just given, where it's all franchises, or are there lots of little small businesses that you can still visibly see competing for business, and therefore are there art independents doing the same thing?
It's a bit of tension because it's a little bit of both. Especially now, the small shops are starting to really emerge. We have like a big maker space where there are like local artists who come and build work and also sell, and so there's a little bit of a community there. But then you also have like the franchised art and all that. So it's a little bit of both. But I can really see like the small community, local community shops really reemerging and really trying to do their own thing as well.
So tell me about the art spaces back home. Over here, the art spaces in particularly Newcastle city centre, it happens in a lot of cities, is that there's not a lot of funding for art space. And so the art spaces that people have tend to be squirreled away in either solitary small spaces where there's a studio because there's a space. The other thing that happens quite a lot is that there's a phenomena where empty buildings, several insurance company buildings, big buildings with many floors, which have now been left empty. So to get relief, the owners of the buildings give it up for what we call a peppercorn rent. So they're very low funded art spaces, and they're at risk because the buildings are either scheduled to be swapped, changed, knocked down, which happens, and then suddenly there's a bunch of homeless artists, not homeless, but studio homeless. And is that similar to Alabama?
I want to say a lot of our artists in Birmingham is really community based. So we have like a lot of galleries that are completely member operated. So the members have their own studio and they contribute to the space, and so it's sustainable in that way. So we have a lot of that, and then of course, Birmingham, where I'm from, we have the big university, so we have a lot of galleries connected to the university, and so of course it's funded through that way. But a lot of it is a little bit of both. But I will say that I guess it's more of a drive to have the community of artists come together and to build something together. And so having that support and having that collective funding allows it to be sustainable.
And from what you know of non-British culture, Amelia, what is it like in Europe? What is the picture like over there of artist spaces?
Well, the interesting thing about the UK is the artist-led community, especially with funding through the late 80s and early 90s up to maybe the early 2000s. There was a massive insurgence of artist-led spaces that were spurred by the fact that individual artists in the UK can apply for funding to open up, independently, and they often used it to open up independent artist-led spaces. This doesn't happen in many other countries in Europe, but the idea of artist spaces is different in every country. For example, in Italy, there's very, very little funding for individual artists. I think that, it's so negligible that it's very hard for artists to even plan anything around funding for their own practice. So what happens there is that there are some spaces called social centers that are large-scale disused buildings, like, for example, swimming pools or old schools that are not used anymore, cinemas, abattoirs sometimes, and a group of people usually take them over and run them for a particular length of time, and they become hubs for cultural events like concerts, arts events, and temporary studios. These social centers then get closed down and filled with other things like flats or developed into commercial spaces, and so they are very temporary and ephemeral. There are also a few instances of artist-led spaces in Italy, but they are mostly self-funded, so artists usually have a side job like working in a shop or doing anything at all, and then the art, especially when there's the start of their career, is funded very little, and it becomes run from a different point of view. In other countries like France, for example, there are other arrangements in which commercial art is more developed, because people in general just buys more art than in other countries, and so especially when there are tourists, it's easier for artists to sell traditional art like paintings and sculpture to tourists or to locals who just want some art in their house, and that means that there is more of a source of income from commercially based art activity, and then the non-commercially based art activity gets funded on the side. There is also an organization in France that supports artists throughout their career by choosing particular artists in each region of France that they consider interesting enough to support over a period of time, and so they give them a salary every month, which is their income, and that allows them to make their art for a number of years, and then the situation gets reviewed later on. But I think that the UK is quite unique in that there is a high percentage of funding that is applicable by individual artists, and that makes them more empowered to form and create initiatives that don't have to necessarily have a commercial aspect, but they have to have a public aspect. So, for example, the insurgence of socially engaged practice is more common because there is more attention to the interaction between the public and the art.
Yeah, I mean, the common approach from the grants for the Arts Council is to say you can do your project, but you need to then have not just audience numbers and engagement through participation in the actual witnessing of the art, but also some kind of sessions where there'll be some more in-depth interactive participation, like a workshop or a talk. Because Antonia, you have a grant through your Fulbright, not through the scholarship, but it's an addition. Tell us about that and what are the requirements for you to have audience engagement.
So I applied for the Brazon Award. So Matthew Brazon, he was a former ambassador, American ambassador in the UK, and he wanted to leave a legacy because before he left, he visited a lot of schools and sixth forms talking to young people, and he wanted to leave a lasting impression. And so he decided to leave funds to enable Fulbright scholars to run an engagement program with sixth formers, so 16 to 18-year-olds. And so for my project, it's titled Abridged, and it's an outreach program where the students will be introduced to the innovation working process. So it's all about brainstorming, generating ideas, prototyping ideas, testing ideas, and then being able to pitch the ideas, and just being able to go through that process and learn while doing. And so it mimics my postgraduate program that I'm studying right now. It's just the whole idea is, how do you prepare students for a future that's unknown? It's all about just being able to be flexible and adaptable, and being able to, undergo change. And so that's the main component of the outreach participatory part of the workshop.
So Amelia, do you think that aspect of British art culture and arts policy would be beneficial in Europe? And if so, how come we haven't exported those ideas to the continent?
I think that every country in Europe, and I guess with Brexit everything will change, because Britain, if Brexit happens, will not be as influential as it is now, but at the same time it's still a place where things can be exported, of course, but if it doesn't participate to the European policy, then it would be a bit more problematic, I think. But I think in every country in Europe there are different realities that have to be applied to the population of artists in those countries. So I don't know why they haven't exported that model, but there are also lots of other models that work. I guess in Scandinavian countries, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on supporting young graduates to start up their career in the arts. So I don't know the exact answer to that question, because I haven't lived in enough European countries to know the reality of that. But in general, it would be incredibly interesting to see an increase in individual funding across Europe for individual artists. And
so, Antonia, in general, what parts of the British arts policy, the culture behind the art that gets done and the funding, what parts of that and what kinds of things have you seen here that you would like to see back home, which you don't already think exists? Or is it the same?
I think there's more of a push here for the arts. Like, for example, we see the Great North exhibition about to happen, and it being really exciting, and that it's the whole culture of like the Northeast it's a pretty huge deal. And I would like to see more of that elevated back home and kind of what I'm doing. And I think hopefully I'm going to be a pioneer within kind of uplifting that, because with my work being not just art based, but it's also science based. So it's the bridge between both. And so it's being able to understand how these two can coexist. And one is not necessarily better than the other, but together, you can do great things. So again, just elevating the importance of the arts and just being able to have students and other artists collaborate to be able to create something that's, has a lasting impact.
And just finally, could you tell me something that you guys in America do that you wish we did over here in reference to kind of arts practice and policy? Is there something that we're not doing that we should be doing?
Well, apart from like the education that I've had, a lot of it's been a bit independent learning, which I get here, but it's a lot more of a mentorship that I miss, that I wish that I had more here, where I guess mentor-mentee programs within like emerging artists and well-established artists. I think that's something that could be useful here.
I mean, that does sound a bit lacking, because I couldn't, for example, recognize one where I've heard of some very big named artist who gets paired with sort of a big brother, little brother, or, you know, for want of a better term, mentor, mentee. Are there any? Are we ignorant, Emilia? Are there programs like that I've not heard of?
There are some programs. For example, AN, the Artist Information Company here in the Northeast, but it's a national organization, has existed since 1980 and has supported the work of artists also through advocacy of the role the artists have in society, and it has programs every year where it helps emerging artists to work in the first few years of their practice, or also if they are stuck, even if they're not early career, and they have a mentorship program. And I was one of the mentors last year. So there are things that are happening. But what I think is lacking in education, for example, in the UK in terms of art, is that the professional development aspect of teaching is a little bit piecemeal, in that there aren't enough programs in UK universities art department where there is a lot of modules or information about what happens after college.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, and I went to what was then the Surrey Institute of Art and Design, now the University of Creative Arts, was that in the sort of middle of your third year on a BA, you would have this unit to choose what kind of career do you want, freelance or running a business, and that was the module choice. And so it was at that point the question was asked, what are you going to do with this? And mine was a film degree, and that became very difficult to actually make a realistic plan for. So my professional practice tutor lectured us, do a sandwich shop, because it makes more financial sense than running a film company. Because if you run a film company on paper, it makes no money, because the economics of film don't scale to a tiny business, not in the sense of making narrative, perhaps short or feature films. So it was very frustrating for me to be told it's not going to work, but I'm teaching you this module anyway. And it was disheartening, but I just shrugged and decided I'm not going to make a sandwich shop because I'm not interested in that. And I think part of the problem might be that if you have full-time busy lecturers and professors and people who are working in art teaching who don't have time for their own practice in a very meaningful way, or they don't get to go on sabbatical enough, the people who they get to do the professional practice, usually the best person would be someone who's currently working in the industries. So somebody who is coming in part-time as an associate or a visiting tutor, who it isn't part of the educational culture that the students are in, but is part of the working culture. And it's a good connection. But what that means is, like you say, it's very piecemeal. Am I unfair on the British education establishment, or is that accurate?
No, this is very accurate. I've lectured at maybe 20 different art colleges in the UK over the past 15 years. And each college invariably has 6 weeks worth of 2-hour lectures in professional development. It's not really any more than that. Some universities have a more integrated approach to professional development. Like, for example, Nottingham Trent University has professional practice embedded in a lot of their art degree. And Manchester Metropolitan University, MMU, also has a unit called Unit X, which I also lecture at, that is a series of lectures throughout the 3 years that they have. But this is very much the exception rather than the rule, because a lot of universities in the UK to do with art pay very little attention to professional practice, and they only have one lecture a year in which I'm parachuted in. And of course, because I'm a professional artist, I feel that my contribution is valuable for new graduates, graduates or people who are just about to graduate. But I feel that more is needed, that is more structured than just 2 hours over the course of 3 years. And I find that sometimes the ex-polytechnics universities in the UK are better at this than other more traditional universities like the Royal College of Art, because they traditionally have paid more attention to the industry aspect of this. So in some universities, I have created modules like Brighton University, which is an ex-poly, and also London Metropolitan University. They recognized that they needed a longer series of lectures on this, but in general, it is not that great on that. And I think it's a real problem because a lot of artists come out of a lot of graduates come out of art school every year. It's around 3,800 a year through recent estimates. And so if those 3,800 new graduates of art and design a year have no clue of what it's like to be a professional artist, then you generate a generation of artists who either give up after a few years because they have no idea how to interact with the art world, or they do things for free for a long time, and so they, in a way, they harm the industry by cheapening the labor because they have no idea how much to charge, for example, and so it's a problem because it creates a situation in which art is not economically valued, and that is a knock-on effect on what the public thinks about the economic value of art, which is there because culture in the UK is worth billions for the economy.
Antonia, can you give us your perspective on your American art degree? Was it any different from what we've been describing?
I would say so. So with my degree, starting off, there was a lot of core classes. So you pick your concentration. So you start off taking like foundations in those courses, but towards the end you do interdisciplinary classes, and then in your final year you have like independent study where you work with your mentor, and a lot of that is like one-on-one interaction. So of course you're getting their advice, their experience, and it goes beyond just assignments. And I really do appreciate having that time, that one-on-one time with professors and my tutors. But here, I guess it's just the resources is that tutors aren't able to really to do that. And so, but it really does make a difference in my opinion, having that one-on-one time, because you learn about life after college or university, I should say, and just like different avenues. And you also get to, opportunities to show your work. It's just a lot more.
Yeah, I think there's a classic standard art school methodology, regardless of the form of art degree, of end of year show. And sometimes the second years get to have a little corner table or something, or a little space, whereas it's like that's the end of your degree. Your end of degree show is the big exhibition. And that's my experience of having gone to an art college and also taught in various art, FE and HE. But can you tell me, are the mentors and professors that you describe, are they professional artists still practicing and working outside of their teaching time? Is that something that inputs on the actual mentor-mentee relationship?
It does. They are working artists as well as professors, and they have to split their time between teaching and also continuing to create work, to talk, to exhibit their work. So I think that dynamic is really useful because they are artists, so they can give you advice not just as a professor but as artist to artist.
Yeah, I think we could use more of that in British teaching, learning and development of artists' careers, really. Okay, so we'll wrap up now. Thanks very much for coming, Emilia, and thanks very much, Antonia. It's been great having you here, and I'll be interested to see how both of your current studies end and what they deliver for art practice and policy locally and internationally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.